Dear colleagues, we are going to do this point number 14, our last point of today's agenda. It is the fight against impunity, with particular focus on International Criminal Court and the Kampala amendments to the Rome Statute, which was decided by the AFET coordinators on the 5th of October 2016. The International Criminal Court, the ECC, was established by the Rome Statute, which entered into force on the 1st of July 2002. The statutes establish the court's functions, jurisdictions and structure, as well as 4 core international crimes: genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes and crimes of aggression. However, the definition for the crimes of aggression was not included in the Rome Statutes. Therefore, the review conference of the Rome Statutes met in Kampala in June 2010 and adopted an amendment to the statute, the so-called Kampala Amendment, defining the crime of aggression in accordance with the United Nations General Assembly Regulation 3314. This amendment, acts of aggressions are invading another state, bombing another state, blockading the ports or coastlines of another state, attacking the land, sea or air forces or marine or sea fleets of another state, violating a statute of forces agreement, using armed bands, groups, irregulars or merchants against another state, and finally allowing territories to be used by another state to perpetrate an act of aggression against a third state. However, while this amendment will come into force 1 year after being ratified, the amendment text says that only crimes of aggression committed 1 year or more after the 30th ratifications are within the jurisdiction of the court. This threshold should be reached at the 1st of January 2017. Furthermore, a decision is to be taken on the amendment by the Assembly of the 124 states parties which have at least a 2/3 majority vote to actually exercise jurisdiction. We have 3 distinguished panelists with us today to discuss the work of the ECC and the possible adoption of the Kampala Amendment, which would have a profound impact of the work, on the work of the court. Mrs. Prost is the head of the cabinet of the president of the ECC, among other high-level legal positions. Ms. Prost is previously ombudsperson for the Secretary Council Al-Qaeda Sanctions Committee, and an ad litem judge at the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia. I'm sorry, I hope I got most of that right. I'll just go on to present the second speaker, Mr. Katzin. He's the Secretary General of the Parliamentarians for Global Action. Over the last 13 years, Mr. Katzin worked to promote the universality and efficientness of the International Criminal Court statute by approximately 100 countries, with his assistance and under the coordination, PGA members contribute on the ratification process of 76 out of the current 124 states parties on the Rome Statutes. He holds a postdoctorate diploma from the Center for Studies and Research of the Hague Academy of International Law and a PhD in Public International Law from the Faculty of Law at University of Teramo in Italy. And last but not least, we have with us today Mr. Barriga, Deputy Head of the Mission of Liechtenstein to the European Union. Mr. Barriga has represented Liechtenstein in various negotiation processes relating to international law, international criminal justice, rule of law and human rights. He served as the Vice Chairperson of the General Assembly's 6th Legal Committee 2006-2007. He acted as the Principal Legal Advisor to the Chair of the negotiations leading to an adoption of amendments to the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court on the crime of aggression. He holds an LLM degree from Columbia University and a doctorate from the Vienna University in Austria. I would like to give our guest the floor. We have agreed on 10 minutes, and we will begin with Ms. Prost.
Thank you very much. It is a pleasure to be here this afternoon to engage on the topic of the fight against impunity in the work of the International Criminal Court. While I know there will be some particular focus on the crime of aggression, I'm going to leave that to my colleagues. I'm going to describe and give a bit more of context as to the work of the court currently, and as well some of the issues and challenges which the ICC faces at this time. And I think it's important, the Chair has referred to the core mandate of this court, which currently is the investigation and prosecution of war crimes, crimes against humanity and genocide, with the crime of aggression as described, the amendments in place, but there are processes to be proceeded with. But I think it's important to emphasize that the court is actually at this time quite busy with its core mandate of prosecuting these crimes. The prosecutor of the court, the Office of the Prosecutor is an organ of the court, is currently conducting 10 investigations in a range of countries: Uganda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Darfur, Sudan, the Central African Republic, Kenya, Libya, Cote d'Ivoire, Mali, and Georgia. If you were counting, that's 9, but there are 2 investigations, separate situations in the Central African Republic. And it's important for some of the comments I'll make about later in the discussion about Africa to know that of these 10 situations that the prosecutor is dealing with, 5 of these cases were referred to the court by the countries themselves involved, so self-referrals. In 2 situations, the Security Council referred the particular situation to the court. So there are 3 cases, essentially, where the prosecutor has selected the situation herself, proprio motu: Kenya, Cote d'Ivoire, and Georgia. The prosecutor is also involved in 10 preliminary examinations, which were in a variety of regions in the world: Afghanistan, Burundi, Colombia, Gabon, Guinea, Iraq, which relates to UK troops, Nigeria, Palestine, the registered vessels of Comoros, Greece, and Cambodia, as well as Ukraine. Those are a preliminary process that the prosecutor undertakes in accordance with the Rome Statute. In the courtroom in The Hague, which is where the court is seated, there are cases in front of the chambers, and last year was a particularly busy year for the ICC. There were 3 final judgments delivered there were 3 judgments delivered, one of which is now final, resulting in 7 convictions, and this spanned an array of cases that broke a number of areas of new ground for the International Criminal Court. We saw the first guilty plea and the first conviction related to the destruction of cultural heritage in relation to the destruction at Timbuktu. First judgments that gave consideration in detail to sexual violence, it's a crime against humanity, and command responsibility, and as well our first case involving offences against the administration of justice for interference with witnesses, a multi-accused trial that was concluded last year. This year there are 3 trials running simultaneously in the courtrooms: Gbagbo and Blé Godet, which relates to the situation in Cote d'Ivoire, Ntaganda, which relates to the DRC, and Ongwen, relating to the Lord's Resistance Army in Uganda. In addition, there are 4 cases which are at the reparations stage. And that's a very unique component of the Rome Statute, the participation of victims and the ability for the court to grant reparations to those victims. And there are, as I indicate, 4 proceedings in consideration before the trial chambers. There is also 2 appeals pending, final appeals related to judgments at trial, as well as interlocutory work and work related to reparations. So, as you can see, it is a busy time for the court. Let me address just raise for your consideration, and happy to discuss further later in the session, some of the challenges that the court faces. And some of these are what I would say are internal and within the court's control, and others which are outside of the court's control to a great extent. One of the issues which is often raised about international criminal justice generally, and in particular with respect to the work of the courts and tribunals, is the length of time that these proceedings take and the question of how efficient is international criminal justice. And that has been the subject, the court, the ICC, has been the subject of much criticism on this point. And these are criticisms and concerns which the court has taken on board and has taken to heart. The current president has made that a central aspect of her presidency, trying to focus on improving the efficiency of the court. The judges have introduced a number of measures after work that they've done together to try and improve efficiency, and we are already seeing improvements in terms of the time that some of these proceedings take as a result. And that is an ongoing project of central importance to the effectiveness of the International Criminal Court. But the factors, the criticisms and the challenges that you will most likely have heard and seen are those coming from in the external context. First, briefly, I will touch on the situation between the court and Africa, which has received considerable attention. There has been much criticism that the court is focused on Africa and that there is an undue attention to the African situation. As well as recently in fall, there were some withdrawals by 3 African states from the Rome Statute. But that situation, and I'm happy to provide more comment on that later, that situation always needs to be considered in context. In particular, Africa was a major contributing region to the foundation of the Rome Statute and the International Criminal Court. Instrumental participation from that region. It is the largest regional group. And there are many reasons behind the situations that have been identified in Africa, not the least of which is, of course, the fact that there were several self-referrals from the African continent. But I also think, and I know my colleague will speak to it, that there is a perspective that the court has focused on situations in Africa in aid of victims in Africa who have been the subject of atrocities in the context of the conflicts there. But there's also another factor which I'll move to shortly, which affects why the court has had so many cases in one region. But I think it is important to understand that there is very much a context behind the African situation with the court. And the court is very focused on engaging with Africa at the moment. Fortunately, we have seen the 2 of the 3 withdrawals have now been withdrawn. South Africa, after a court proceeding in South Africa, has withdrawn its withdrawal notice, and the Gambia followed suit or had done the same after the change of government there. There remains a withdrawal notice from Burundi, which will take effect 1 year after it was filed in October of next year. But there have been no other withdrawals, despite concerns that this might have started a trend. So I'll just lay out those factors and move to the other perhaps significant challenge for the International Criminal Court. This has been a criticism from Africa, but more generally as well, and that is why the court focuses only on select regions. It's been a particular question that's asked with the atrocities and conflicts in other areas. There's been particular mention of the situation in Syria. Why has the court not taken up circumstances there? And the reason, of course, is a factor outside of the control of the International Criminal Court, which is it is a treaty-based court, which means that its jurisdiction is restricted to states parties to the Rome Statute, of which there are currently 124. And those states parties have to be involved in the particular situation, either in that the action is occurring with respect to the territory, or the involvement, the alleged involvement relates to nationals of a state party. And the result is that the Rome Statute simply does not have universal jurisdiction and universal application, and the court's jurisdiction, therefore, does not reach some of these situations, and that is particularly challenging when we see conflicts outside of the reach of the court. The only sustainable solution to that problem is having more states parties to the Rome Statute, the quest for universality. That is vital to the court's effectiveness and credibility for this reason. And it is also important because adherence to the Rome Statute by states signals a commitment to international law, peace and security, and standing in solidarity with victims. For all these reasons, that is a key priority for the court, which we pursue in partnership, the goal of universality. And my final point is simply to reflect on that. I've mentioned that we do so in partnership. One of the court's main partners in many areas is the European Union, and we are tremendously grateful for the support which the Union has given to the court, both operationally and through cooperation, and strong and consistent political support, including from Parliament, which has adopted many resolutions in support of the work of the court. So that relationship is essential for the work of the court, and we are appreciative of all of the interaction we have with the European Union and the support provided. There are a number of other issues I could touch on, but I'm going to close there and pass on to my colleagues, but would be happy to provide answers to questions or comments on these areas. Thank you.
Thank you so much. We give the floor to the next speaker, Mr. Catton, 14 minutes.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I'm very grateful to be here, and especially quite honored to be in a room dedicated to Alcide De Gasperi as an Italian national. I consider that a great honor. I also want to pay tribute to the European Parliament, as Judge Prost did, in the sense that the European Parliament has been at the avant-garde of the movement for international criminal justice. It was the European Parliament that in the early 1990s called for the creation of a permanent court at a time when the international community was struggling creating ad hoc tribunals for Yugoslavia and considering one for the Rwandan genocide. And I think that that vision paid a very important result today. As of today, more than 24,000 African victims applied to participate in recorded proceedings before the ICC. More than 10,000 have been afforded status locus standi as participants in proceedings. About 6,000 Georgian victims also applied in pre-trial proceedings at the court. That means that more than 30 individuals came to The Hague to join the court and observe its proceedings with the view of expressing their views and concerns. I find this a very important success for the court, whereby the opposition of the court, as Parliamentarians for Global Action had the possibility to observe in many national parliaments, comes in most of the cases from the top leadership, those individuals who believe they are above the law and they are not really satisfied with the notion that there is a court in The Hague that could, should their national state fail to conduct genuine investigation and prosecution, fill that impunity gap that unfortunately has been used by many to commit mass atrocity crimes as of today. So the ICC, we see the ICC as a very impactful institution, and by the fact that it does its job, it naturally creates opposition. We don't see any crisis around the ICC in Africa simply because the ICC is doing it's carrying out its mandate. And this is the natural reaction of certain individuals, some of them heads of states, who would like to exercise their function as usual, but today they are touched upon by an arrest warrant for genocide, crimes against humanity and war crimes, and therefore their ability to interact with others is somehow limited or constrained. There are massive crimes today that are committed in specific areas of the world that are outside the jurisdiction of the ICC. For example, Syria, which is by far the largest and most bloody conflict in the world. our organization, Parliamentarians for Global Action, together with all the NGOs belonging to the CICC and leading human rights NGOs like Human Rights Watch and Amnesty International, we opposed any impunity deal or arrangement that impedes the exercise of jurisdiction by the ICC. In particular, we saw that in full flesh when the veto materialized in the Security Council in the month of May 2014, before that the city of Mosul ended up in the hands of ISIS, when the Russian Federation and the People's Republic of China vetoed a proposal by France, supported by all the other member states of the Security Council, to refer the situation of Syria to the jurisdiction of the International Criminal Court. This was simply a reiteration of an agreement that already existed, aimed at creating an impunity zone in Syria. There are also other very serious situations of our conflict where mass atrocities are committed. Just make an example, Yemen, not discussed so much in the media, where, however, we have evidence of certain deals being made to cover up for the crimes that are being committed. So there is a very serious issue of impunity today in the world, but in most of the cases, it happens outside the scope of jurisdiction of the ICC, and this is to the merit of the ICC for having had a certain impact. One of the most touching testimonies that we collected from our membership took place a few months ago in the Central African Democratic Republic of the Congo, where the opposition had designated a certain day of September as La Ville Morte in Kinshasa, the dead city. And major incidents were expected to occur between protesters and the government. On that very day, the Office of the Prosecutor of the Court requested the Parliamentarians for Global Action to have an informal meeting with members of parliament from different sides of the political spectrum. Well, by alerting and inviting politicians from all sides to that meeting, the news spread that the Office of the Prosecutor was in town. That single day, not a single victim has been accounted in the street of Kinshasa. Our members believe it was because the ICC was there, was visible and present there. We cannot count deterrents. You cannot account for things that do not happen. It's impossible. But in reality, we know that many decision makers have in mind what can happen next, and so they do not trigger the order that may bring about mass atrocities in certain situations falling under the court jurisdiction. Again, that is not a panacea to solve the conflicts of the world and the human rights violations and the repressions and the troubled democratic transitions, as for example now in the DRC, but it's better to have the ICC than not to have it in such a difficult situation. This brings me to my fourth and most important point, and to the crime of aggression. These are crimes, mass atrocity crimes, are committed by leaders. Leaders who can lead the apparatus of the state, or also lead non-governmental or non-state actors that have the ability to carry out large military attacks, mainly directed against the civilians. Now, in Nuremberg in 1945, we adjudicated 4 international crimes. Crimes against humanity, including, of course, genocide, then spelled out in 1948 with the Genocide Convention, war crimes, and crimes against the peace. Now, crimes against the peace were taken out or were not considered for the active jurisdiction of the ad hoc tribunals created in the 90s, because they were seen as the atrocities committed during those conflicts were seen as the result of internal armed conflict or non-international armed conflict. However, in 1998, when the Rome Statute was adopted, and I vividly remember Judge Hans-Peter Kaul's testimony before a meeting that PGA organized in this very parliament 3 years ago, before he sadly passed away, when he reminded us, but we managed to put the crime of aggression in Article 5 of the Rome Statute with the idea that this crime had to go back to where it was in 1945. And here we are in the year 2017. We now have 34 ratifications, 35 I must say, because Argentina also deposited, or maybe 34 because Portugal and Argentina, there is an next upcoming one, and I'm getting faster than the facts. And this is when the Assembly of State Parties this year is called to decide with a vote, yes or no, whether to have this jurisdiction of the court activated on the crime of aggression. On the 17th of July 2014, on the initiative of MEP Barbara Lochbihler, there was an almost unanimously adopted resolution of the European Parliament. If I don't remember wrongly, there was only one vote against. And that resolution called upon a very strong support for the Kampala amendments and the activation of the court jurisdiction. Here I want to be, so this is the positive side of the story. But as every story, there is also, as every compromise, there is also a limiting one, which is that the acts of aggression that, Honourable Chairman, you enlisted at the beginning of your presentation, as they were drafted in Resolution 3314, adopted by the UN General Assembly in 1974, in reality are limited, are restricted, because we have a paragraph 1 that tells us that the crime of aggression occurs only if a military or political leader of a state illegally orders or otherwise plans and carries out a use of force against another state that by character, gravity and scale is a manifest violation of the United Nations Charter. So this threshold was included of gravity, character and scale and manifest violation to limit the scope of the crime of aggression, to limit any gray zones, any zones of confusion with maybe legal uses of forces that would not bring about that level of gravity that we're seeing in World War II and in other wars of aggression, so to make sure that the compromise could be accepted by all. And in fact, it was accepted by all, because it was adopted by consensus. There are still discussions about how to interpret the entry into force versus activation. These are technicalities. What we support in terms of my organization, Parliamentarians for Global Action, is that finally we bring about that unity of crimes as we had in 1945. Equality of all before the law is the foundation of the Rome Statute system. The European Union, and I will finish on this point, the European Union can still make a difference. It has made a difference in the past. It is the only regional organization or transnational organization with an action plan, with a common position that means activities on the ground, that means a lot of démarches, that means political clauses like in Article 11.7 of the Cotonou Agreement. A number of tools are in place. But let me only point to one today, to be precise. I think that the EU should be stronger, it has been strong, but it should be even stronger, on partnering with Ukraine so that it finally adheres to what it was agreed and ratified by the Parliament in terms of the EU-Ukraine Association Agreement. This is a country in which a part of its territory has been unlawfully seized by another state. The crime of aggression, of course, will not apply retrospectively. It will enter into force only at the end of 2017, and it may not apply to individuals who are nationals of state non-parties. Nevertheless, as we discussed with our members in the Rada of Ukraine at least 3 times, committing war crimes or crimes against humanity in the framework of an unlawful use of force may be considered by the judges as an aggravating factor. And we want to have Ukraine as a state party to the Rome Statute, not only to afford for good jurisdiction to the court on all the other mass atrocity crimes, but also to be one of those casting a positive vote for the activation on the crime of aggression jurisdiction. So I call upon, we did it already, but I call again to the European Parliament to ask the entire EU to make its voice stronger with the Ukrainian partners, because they committed, they changed the constitution, but it didn't happen yet. And maybe a little help from our friends, from their friends, can bring them into the Rome. Thank you very much.
And on that friendly note, we'll go for the third speaker, Mr. Barriga, for 10 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chair. It is a great honor to be here today, and at the same time, it is quite a challenge to follow these 2 eminent speakers who have given us quite a comprehensive presentation already. What I can maybe do is primarily give you a bit more context and a bit more background on the crime of aggression, and maybe say something about the significance both legal and political, about the upcoming activation of the ICC's jurisdiction over the crime of aggression. By way of background, indeed, as David has also already alluded to, one has to start at least at the Nuremberg and Tokyo trials, where after World War II, leaders of Nazi Germany and Japanese leaders were prosecuted and convicted for what was then called crimes against peace. And the term crime of aggression and crime against peace, I think, can be used pretty much as in a synonymous manner. More specifically, at the time, what these persons were convicted for was the planning, preparation, initiation, or waging of a war of aggression, But it was not further specified at the time what aggression actually means. And it took later on the United Nations General Assembly several decades to come up with a definition of what aggression means. And by aggression, I think we have to distinguish, on the one hand, what's in the UN Charter. In the UN Charter, in Article 2.4, you find the prohibition of, if you will, the regular use of force. But crime of aggression is something beyond that, is of even greater gravity, something even more significant. And so in 1974, the General Assembly agreed on a definition of aggression, which was based, as I said, on Article 2.4 of the UN Charter, on the definition of the use of force. And quite significantly, and I think it bears adding to what the chair said at the beginning of our session, he listed these various acts: invasion, bombardment, and so on. For these acts to qualify as aggression, they have to be in contravention of the UN Charter. That means they have to be either not in self-defense or otherwise not authorized by the Security Council. So we had a basic definition in 1974 of what aggression by one state against another means. But that is not yet the definition of what the crime means for the individual who may be accused in front of a criminal court. For that to happen, we had to get to the Rome Conference in 1998, where, as David mentioned, delegations managed at least to get a placeholder, or maybe a bit more than a placeholder, into the Rome Statute. Specifically, if you look at Article 12 of the Rome Statute, it actually says that states parties to this statute accept the court's jurisdiction over, inter alia, the crime of aggression, even though at that time it was not yet defined in clear letters in the Rome Statute, and even though at that time what was decided was to mandate a negotiation process that would lead to a definition and that would lead to more clarity on the conditions for jurisdiction. This process took place primarily between 2003 and 2010, and it was chaired by the ambassador of Liechtenstein to the United Nations in New York. That's probably the reason why I'm here today, and why I could, maybe especially in the questions and answers session later, maybe give you a bit more insight into what actually happened during those negotiations. But to sum it up, we found during those 7-8 years an agreement on two big parts of the Kampala amendments. The first part, of course, is the definition of aggression. Has been touched upon a few times already. We talk about the most serious forms of the illegal use of force as prohibited by the UN Charter. And the agreement on that definition we found already in February 2009, more than a year prior to the review conference in Kampala, which goes to show that the definition as such is actually not particularly controversial. And it was, I should add that, at the time adopted not just by ICC states parties, but the definition itself was adopted in a special working group that was open to all UN member states, ICC states parties or not. They could come around and agree to this definition of aggression, the most serious forms of the illegal use of force. The second part of the package was jurisdictional questions, which turned out to be much more difficult, even though maybe at first glance it sounds like a mere technicality. But behind the term conditions of jurisdiction, you'll find at least two sets of problems that are quite tricky. The first set of problems relates to the question, what should be the role of the UN Security Council when it comes to the ICC adjudicating crimes of aggression in the future? And on this issue, I must say we found a quite remarkable compromise, namely that the ICC would not depend on a prior authorization by the UN Security Council to proceed with an investigation into a crime of aggression. There are a few other conditions that need to be fulfilled in such cases, but basically we managed to safeguard the independence of the ICC vis-à-vis the Security Council when it comes to the crime of aggression. A second part of the jurisdiction package was the question of state consent. To what extent should the ICC's jurisdiction over aggression be limited to cases involving states that in one way or another have agreed to this jurisdiction? That is actually something particularly striking about the ICC's statute. Under the other three core crimes, you do not in all cases need the consent of all the states concerned. If a national of an ICC non-state party commits crimes on the territory of an ICC state party, there is jurisdiction, even though, as I said, that state may not have accepted the Rome Statute. Now, when it comes to aggression, delegations were split on the question whether we should have the same system in this regard. Some states wanted to keep the exact same system, which of course is good for potential victims of aggression. It provides them protection. It would mean that if such a state would ratify the amendments and even an ICC non-state party would commit aggression on its territory, that there could be jurisdiction. But quite a few other states thought that would go too far. They wanted something more consent-based, something more traditional in our treaty system, and insisted on something where you would need the consent in one form or another of the states concerned. And in the end, we did have to make a compromise, and we found a compromise on this issue, which actually quite restricts the court's jurisdiction over aggression to what you can summarize as a consent-based system. And the core of this consent-based system is that, on the one hand, you exclude acts of aggression committed by states that are not parties to the Rome Statute. Non-states parties are excluded, both as potential aggressors and as victims. And when it comes to states parties to the Rome Statute, we established an opt-out system, meaning there is a presumption that they have accepted jurisdiction, but they can opt out by way of a declaration to the registrar. When it comes to jurisdiction, there is a third little element that we had to put into the package in Kampala, namely a special activation mechanism. Again, something that is rather unusual, but just reflects how difficult the compromise was. Delegations were not ready to have the court's jurisdiction start right away. They wanted some more breathing room for this complex package to sit there to be digested, and they said we have two conditions for the court to exercise jurisdiction. Namely, we would like to have at least 30 ratifications to show political support for the amendments, and we would like a decision by states parties basically to turn on the switch and activate these amendments. And that can take place no earlier than 2017. We are in 2017. Discussions are ongoing on this, and we expect this decision in December this year. In terms of ratifications, I should state that we have 34 ratifications to date. I would like to echo David's praise for the European Parliament for the resolution adopted in 2014. In the meantime, 18 EU member states have ratified the amendments, and certainly we hope more will join. In those discussions on activation, also as David alluded to, there's some back and forth over a rather technical point regarding the opt-out mechanism that I'm happy to elaborate further on in Q&A session. To conclude, let me make 3 short points about the significance of the Kampala amendments. Number 1, the Kampala amendments close what is a gaping hole in international criminal law. The crime of aggression has not been adjudicated since the Nuremberg and Tokyo tribunals at the international level. And that, I think, is very significant, because what does it mean to allow the ICC to adjudicate the crime of aggression? It means we allow the ICC to enforce what is probably the single most important provision of the UN Charter. The ICC will enforce the prohibition of the illegal use of force in the most serious cases. Second, will there be many cases on the crime of aggression at the ICC? And I'm wrapping up. I would say that is not very likely because the jurisdiction is very limited. But actually, there is a real advantage for the ICC to prosecute aggression. And the ICC President's Chief of Staff was talking about the very busy court. You might say that at first sight, maybe aggression might make the court even busier, but there's a different aspect to that. In many situations, what happens is that not just one type of crime is committed, but different types of crimes. And the crime of aggression is actually particularly easy to prosecute because it is the definition, it is the crime that is committed by the leader. It is actually easier to prove that a leader intended to invade another country than to prove that the leader intended that his or her soldiers would commit war crimes along the way. So in terms of what the prosecutor does, aggression is actually, and I don't say this lightly, easier business. And thirdly, the third point of significance is at the domestic level. Already prior to Kampala, but especially afterwards, states have criminalized crime of aggression in their domestic criminal codes. The significance of that cannot be overstated because, of course, the ICC has a limited reach. But there is probably no more effective and efficient deterrent than having domestic national judiciaries being there in control when their governments might want to commit or may have committed crimes of aggression. That, I think, can really not be overstated. I conclude here, and I'm standing ready also for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much for these three very interesting presentations. We now go to the Q&A session. The first one who have requested the floor is our colleague from the Green Group, Ms. Lochbihler.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. And before I start with my question, I would also like to say that we started this program more than half an hour earlier than it was on the program. And it's just to you, as you come from outside, our guest speakers, be assured that in many forms, like we prepare a report in this committee on addressing human rights violations in the context of war crime, crimes against humanity, including genocide and so on. We work in many different ways on the issue and strengthening the ICC. But you may not see so many colleagues here because they have to run. Also, we have 3 similar committees at the same time. And I know that one colleague who is very involved will arrive, I think, in 10 minutes to have more questions, just to assure you. Now, it gives, of course, then more time for questions, and I have several. To you, Madam Prost. And thank you all to your very interesting statements. Now, the challenges you underlined, I agree, that are challenges for the ICC. And one I would like to ask is also how can you bridge, for example, the distance of a court who is in Den Haag with the public debate, perhaps in a rural area where war crimes have occurred? How do you try to reach populations where a high percentage perhaps is not able to consume in English international reporting? And I think that is very important that those people who have been suffering so much, that their rulers decided to wage war and commit also war crimes, that they understand that this is no longer the case, that they are being punished for that. A second question relates to the criticism, unjust criticism of some African governments that the International Criminal Court is biased. It is very fortunate, and Mr. Katin has said this, that a lot of other African governments and populations and civil societies counters this already. And, but still, it's a little bit fragile, I would say. But I think some years ago there was a serious attempt made by the ICC to open an office in the African Union themselves to help the African governments to understand, for example, the consequences if they ratify. What does this mean for the national legislation? Perhaps now, I think also with a new leadership in the African Union, is this a plan to start again, to be of a good service directly in Addis Ababa? And then perhaps you could also, and then of course victims of war crimes. Could you update us on the situation of the Victims' Trust Fund? And in another case where the Parliament, of course, is also, we follow a lot of human rights violations, and we had in October recently a resolution on the human rights violations in the Philippines. And now I read in the media that some lawyers also try to approach the International Criminal Court, that the involvement perhaps of the Philippine president in how can I say, in severe human rights violations will be a case for the ICC, if you can speak on that. Now, questions to Mr. Barriga from Liechtenstein. I looked up our Parliament's resolution from 2014. And there we said Liechtenstein, we complimented Liechtenstein for doing even a handbook how to implement the criminal code. Yes, so I think, and I see from your report, obviously some governments have read this. Now, we have 7 member states in the European Union who have not ratified, and when I read, then I can see that 5 are seriously working on it, and there are 2 others who don't. Perhaps you could help us giving some advice what we can do that they also ratify. And if I understand you correctly, because now if we have 30 state parties ratified, then after January 2017, we said in that resolution we could establish a permanent system of international criminal accountability by penalizing the crime of aggression. Did I understand you right that you say it will perhaps happen by December this year? Okay. So because now we are also preparing our Parliament's resolution to the United Nations General Assembly, and perhaps this is a very useful information that we could put into this resolution, also kind of a priority for the EU to work on that. To David Katin. Now, your Parliamentarians for Global Action is based in New York. I assume you follow also the debate of the Security Council. And you reflect on the situation that there is no more blockade to perhaps referring Security Council resolutions on the crime of aggression to the ICC. But could you also elaborate a little bit on the general climate inside the Security Council for discussing issues where they could refer cases to the ICC? Because I understood also in the past, perhaps it is referred, but the states do not necessarily also put the necessary resources then to the ICC to follow up on that issues. I think so far my questions, maybe Chair, if you are so generous, if I could also pose a question. I saw that the representative from the EIS arrived, but arrived also in the middle of the presentations. But so I assume she may have the floor, and then I give a warning. I would like to ask, in this resolution from 2014, the Parliament asked, as a second call for, that the EU should adopt a common position on the crime of aggression. To my following, I don't think we have this. Could you perhaps reflect on this, how far we are? Is there a debate to have an EU common position on that? Even not all the member states have ratified. Thank you.
Yes, of course we can. We will give the floor to the EES if they wish to give some remarks or questions or put out the Commission EES point of view on this. So the floor is yours.
Sorry. Thank you. I'm not used to this room. Thank you very much indeed. My name is Mercedes Garcia. I'm the head of Division for Human Rights in the External Action Service. I'm delighted to join you today, and warm welcome to all of the speakers, and apologies for being late. Colleagues tried to tell us that this had started earlier, but we didn't make it on time. Anyway, just a few words on behalf of the EAS, and at the risk of repeating statements that might have been made before, I just wanted to recall that the European Union obviously considers the Rome Statute as an essential achievement in international criminal justice. Of course, the International Criminal Court embodies universal norms and values that we all support because we think the victims of international crimes deserve justice wherever they live. The EU Global Strategy on Foreign and Security Policy reiterated this engagement of the European Union with the ICC no later than last year, so continued support is obviously our line, and we remain a strong defender of the rule of law and a staunch supporter of the ICC. And therefore, we also feel it's our mission to continue to work with all governments and people to support the ICC as a key institution to fight impunity. 2016 was a difficult year in terms of some of the notices of withdrawal that we saw, and I'm sure it's been mentioned before, but we are now in a very different place than last year, with two of those countries having withdrawn their withdrawals, so there's only Burundi left at present. We think 2017 should be a very different year, hopefully where more countries will join the ICC, and therefore advance the objective of universality. This was part of a very positive discussion with the ICC last week, where we celebrated our annual roundtable between the External Action Service and the court. Some of the issues have been mentioned already with the disproportionate focus on certain regions, and in particular Africa. I'm sure the panelists will have a number of answers for the questions posed. In our opinion, in 2016, with the opening of an investigation in the case of Georgia, the court showed that the scope and the powers of the court are global, and of course they're subject to the jurisdiction of the court. And we also know that the prosecutor is looking at a number of preliminary examinations in relation to situations not only in Europe, but also in the Middle East, in Asia, and in South America. And a question has been posed on the situation in the Philippines, indeed, which is a very interesting one. Briefly on the crime of aggression, as it's been said before, 18 of our member states have ratified the Kampala Amendment so far, so indeed there's no EU-wide position or resolution on it. It is a sovereign decision by each of our member states to join or not to join, but of course this is discussed in the framework of one of the working parties of the Council in a dedicated working group on legal issues dealing with the ICC, and is regularly discussed. So of course there are sort of coordination initiatives by our own member states, those who have already ratified, of course, which have an interest in others joining as well. Just briefly, just wanted to make a couple of points on other arguments that have been made on the Rome Statute. In particular, one that was made in the context of South Africa withdrawing from the Rome Statute that has since come back. We believe that abiding by the Rome Statute does not prevent sustainable peace does not hinder countries from playing a constructive role in peace processes. I think this is an important point to make because it can otherwise lead to obviously a big disincentive for countries. And I think, for example, as shown in recent peace processes such as in Colombia, where the ICC has also taken an interest, impunity does not to be part of the equation when it comes to peace processes. I'll leave it at that. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and look forward to the interventions by the speakers. Thanks.
I'll just allow myself a question. hopefully our colleague will arrive soon as well, so we can have all the questions before the answers. It tends to be the right way to go around. I just have a couple of things from your presentation, and maybe you can very easily clarify them for me. I had the privilege in an earlier part of my life to study law and also international law, and of course I can see the red line from the Nuremberg tribunals, and the President said down there to what we are attempting to do today with this. And therefore I'm quite interested by your statements that this is somehow easier to prosecute, because I think if we go back to the Nuremberg trials, I find them to be in general a large success, but I think this particular part about proving aggressive warfare, which is sort of the equivalent of this, proved a bit judicially challenging for the prosecutors at Nuremberg. So maybe you could elaborate a little bit upon why you see the similarities and where you see this to be different from some of the challenges that was met back then in Nuremberg, especially the question upon you can say when is a war justified and when is it not, especially in this regard of detaching this from the UN Security Council. It might just be my ignorance that talks here, but I would be happy to just have a little bit more of elaboration on that. Another question I would like just to very quickly ask is, one of you mentioned Ukraine. Could you be a little bit more specific in how the European Union could best facilitate Ukraine's adaptation into this, and what kind of action you would like us to take from the European Parliament in that regard? And the last question I have is about jurisdiction, because a lot of these things will have different jurisdictions also in international law. A lot of these things would also maybe be covered by the European Human Rights Convention. Some of them might be covered by, for instance, the Charter for Fundamental Rights in the European Union. How are you solving? And I assume that other international framework, regional or international, could also apply in other regions of the world. So in that scenario, of course, maybe the European Union member states are not first among the countries that are likely to be infringed, but in the wider European Council, I could see multiple cases arising in the future. Could you maybe just tell a little bit about how are you solving any questions of jurisdiction? Who would have jurisdiction? We have already now seen between the court in Strasbourg and Luxembourg a bit of a fight over who is the Supreme Court when it comes to human rights in Europe. So just out of interest, has that been resolved, or how would you see that from your point of view? Because now it seems like we have a triangle of courts in that region of Europe that could potentially all have an interest in a particular case. I'm just looking if my colleague have arrived. It doesn't look to be the case. So would you allow me just to go to you to answer or comment or answer the initial questions, and then maybe allow for our colleague to do a second round when she arrives? Is that okay? I think we'll do the same line then. So Ms. Prost, if you want to start.
Thank you very much. Some very interesting questions. The first point which you raised is, of course, a very central point for the court. We've learned many lessons from the international criminal tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, which preceded the establishment. That outreach to the communities when you're sitting so far away from the actual crime areas is critically important, and that has been a priority for the International Criminal Court. So we have an entire program on outreach which attempts to do precisely what you described, bridge the gap between The Hague and these communities. And we do this in a variety of ways. We have field offices which are established in a number, not all, but a number of the situation countries when there is an ongoing investigation, but it carries on during the trial proceedings and also to deal with issues that go on past the actual trial proceedings. We also do missions, including missions by the principals, the prosecutor, the president, and the registrar of the court. By example, when the Ongwen trial ended recently, which is the trial related to allegations related to the Lord's Resistance Army's activities in northern Uganda, the registrar was there for the opening of the trial, which was broadcast in the region. So we also have the reparations and participation role of victims in the proceedings, and they are represented in the proceedings themselves, and so that too gives the community an opportunity, and there are missions undertaken to register victims who wish to participate. So it is not a perfect system. Obviously there are resource constraints which limit our ability, for example, as you rightly identify, to translate the proceedings into local languages, but we do take as many efforts as we can to try and focus on that very important component that perhaps has not received the focus it should have historically in other contexts. So I hope that gives you some sense on that. As I mentioned, the criticism related to the Africa focus of the court, a number of the factors I already identified that led to this situation. In terms of addressing the situation, as I mentioned, we do very much emphasize dialogue with African states. There are different voices that come from Africa, of course, civil society, as well as different states having different views, and we're very much open to all forms of dialogue. We do this at the officials level. We do this with the principals of the court, traveling to Africa, to various seminars, to presentations. The president of the court was recently in Uganda with the trust fund, meeting in various communities, discussing the situation in the country. So there is a lot of outreach that's focused on trying to address the concerns that Africa and Africans have. The issue of the office remains a very difficult one. The court remains ready. We have a liaison office in New York to deal with the United Nations, and we are very anxious to establish an office so that we could have a better liaison with the African Union, but so far we have not been, there has not been agreement by the African Union for the establishment of the office, but we continue to raise it every opportunity we get, and we also do seminars there, at least, which are funded by the European Union, and we're very grateful for that, to try and encourage more of that dialogue and to raise that issue of the liaison office. The trust fund is a matter very close to the heart of the President, and it is something that she speaks to often. The trust fund is a component of the Rome Statute, so it's interconnected but an independent body. It's been established in order to have funds which can complement in reparation orders. Reparations orders are directed towards a convicted person, but often there are no funds available from that individual, or the funds have not been located, and the trust fund participates very much in these reparation orders. It also has an assistance mandate where the trust fund is often the body representing the court that remains. For example, in Uganda, these projects have been ongoing for many years when the court has a number of outstanding warrants but has not been otherwise present in these regions. So the trust fund is a very important component of the Rome Statute system that reflects very much this outreach to victims. It is constantly struggling, though, to promote the existence of the trust fund and to obtain funding for the trust fund, and has currently a number of efforts ongoing to try and raise additional funds for the important assistance mandate it carries out, as well as the reparations component. Unfortunately, and there's been much publicity about it, the situation with the Philippines is one where there have now been, as you mentioned, publicized action by individuals to bring the situation to the attention of the court. So I will not comment on it. It falls within the purview of the prosecutor independently. So I would never tread on Madam Bensouda's area of, so I'm unfortunately not able to comment on that particular point. I did want to respond to the question on jurisdiction as well. The interesting thing about the Rome Statute is that it has a very unusual jurisdiction form. I mentioned the territorial and national participation of alleged offenders, but the court is a complementary court, and it is established firmly on the principle of complementarity. In fact, what was established through the Rome Statute was not a court alone. It was an entire system, and a system which is designed first and foremost to encourage states, and states as individually or as a group of states, regional organizations or courts. They have the primary responsibility to carry out prosecutions, investigations and prosecutions with respect to these crimes. And the ICC's jurisdiction is solely in those instances when there is no state, and that could include a state exercising universal jurisdiction, as we've seen in the context of the Senegal prosecution. So when there is no state that is willing or able, when states are unwilling or unable to carry out the prosecution, that's when the ICC has jurisdiction. And it's trite now, perhaps, but there was often the statement made that the ICC would be a great success if it never had a case, because it would mean that all of the prosecutions were being conducted in the national jurisdictions. And it's a really important point to remember in terms of all of the criticism that sometimes arises. This court is never meant to replace national jurisdictions. It is there as a complement to bring an end to impunity. So I just wanted to highlight that particular point.
And then also I myself is better informed, so we will go on to the next speaker.
Thank you very much. Regarding the question on the UN Security Council, I think what has happened in the Security Council is particularly telling. When the Sudan situation was referred to the jurisdiction of the court, the Council acted with the abstention of several major powers. That was in 2005. When the Security Council referred the situation regarding Libya in 2010, it was a unanimous decision. 2011, at the beginning of 2011, it was a unanimous decision. So one would say, oh, now the Security Council supports the court. The opposite. I don't think now the permanent members, as I said in May 2014, there were vetoes. There has been other pocket vetoes, for example, on a proposal by Spain to refer the situation of Sri Lanka to the jurisdiction of the court. One member state opposed a pocket veto, a threat to use the veto, and it didn't go on the floor. There were other situations that are similar to this one. Now, let's analyze why certain situations have not gone through in the way that it should have. When the Security Council then adopted Security Council Resolution 1973 on the use of force, there was an operation that was lawful under international law to use force in the territory of Libya. However, the previous resolution asking the court to take action was never followed up by the Council. The Council never told the Libyan authorities, the new Libyan authorities, now you behave as a good brother and sister of the international community, you arrest and surrender the persons wanted by the court to The Hague, you accept whatever measures are needed to join the Rome Statute and so on and so forth. Actually, we had evidence in The Hague, not in New York, that states talk to the court so that the court, but the court is independent, so the court ignores those efforts of states that are an intrusion on its independence, not to actually take over the cases from Libyan jurisdiction. that were seized with certain matters, and in the Al-Senussi case, the court decided that the Libyan jurisdiction should take precedence. In the case of the colonel Gaddafi, he was brutally killed, unarmed. It was a summary execution. It was certainly a violation of human rights law, if not a war crime. And none of the major powers that intervene in Libya asked the Libyans to arrest Gaddafi and send him to The Hague. I don't recall any public statement to that effect. So we have a major problem with the Council. Besides the fact that the Syrian situation and other situations may have seen what I have called an impunity deal with those who are committing major crimes by certain powers, we also have failure of the Council to follow up on its own decisions to expand the jurisdiction of the Court. So I think at the moment there is no appetite for the Council to take action. In fact, at the end of December, upon proposal also of Liechtenstein and Malta and other states, the General Assembly created a mechanism to preserve evidence on the Syrian situation, which is a bit of a desperate move, but still we supported it better than nothing to show that more than 100 and plus states voted for that resolution. It means that a minority wants to preserve impunity. The vast majority of states are committed to justice. Maybe it's not now the historic moment in which to make it happen outside the Rome Statute system, but we will preserve the evidence for that to happen later on. So there will be windows of opportunities in the future in the Council. It's really up to the bodies like the European Parliament and national parliaments to keep that momentum alive so that when a moment comes, and then with better resolutions, as you pointed out, where the Council and the UN system would co-fund those investigations, because it's clear that the court has 124 member states, a lot, but if the broader 193 member states membership of the UN requests the court to intervene, it's the 193 member states that must pay, not the 124 state parties. So that is and it's forecasted by the statute. It's provided by the statute. So the next resolutions, we hope they will refer any situation concerning any crime. So it will be the 4 crimes, not only the 3. But maybe we will have to wait quite a number of years. But let's try to continue to create windows of opportunities in that respect. The other question was about what the EU should do about getting Ukraine in the court. Well, Ukraine has already done quite something in the sense that it changed its constitution, stating, like Turkey did, and Turkey didn't join, the new Article 124 stipulates that Ukraine may accept the jurisdiction of the ICC. Again, also Turkey did it more than 10 years ago, but it didn't ratify. So it creates a faculty, an authority. On the top of that, unfortunately, the presidential administration imposed in its package, which was not drafted by experts as far as we understood, because Parliament had seen an expert draft that didn't contain this, there was a 3-year transitional provision to postpone the entry into force only of this article to the year 2019, basically when Mr. Poroshenko will not be the president, or when there will be maybe a newly elected president, we don't know who. So it is a little bit of sending the hot potato to the next administration. This is a bit of a Pilatesque politic that the EU should stand for against and remind the Ukrainian partners to say, well, you have changed your constitution, now remove this transitional clause. The court is a court of law. There is nothing to fear if you are a law-abiding partner of us and the international community as a whole. We want to prevent crimes. We want to save the life of victims. If having the court can deter some crimes, yes, it should happen. It shouldn't be the reason why to postpone. Like the Prime Minister of Iraq apparently told the PGA members in a private meeting, not yet, not now, because I need first to solve the Mosul situation. It's not the right argument. It should be right now so that we save as many lives as possible and we abide by the law when we use armed force. So, this is the type of engagement that we would like to see. Of course, we know that the High Representative did a very important job in Kiev, in bilaterals, and the EU delegation in Kiev is doing very important work in this framework. But having also political leaders like you from the European Parliament standing for this, you also have a committee with the Ukrainian Parliament, and using that could be a very important platform to move forward this agenda.
All right, let me try to address some of these excellent questions as well. First, Madam Lochbihler asked me if I had any advice on how to entice those very few EU member states who have not been really moving forward with the ratification of the Kampala amendments. And obviously, I think these states have also seen and read the handbook, and there's lots of arguments in there as to why they should be ratified. But I find it quite remarkable. At the moment, my understanding is that their main hesitation, their main concern has to do with this discussion that we alluded to earlier, a technical discussion about what the opt-out mechanism means. And I'll try to put this in as untechnical terms as possible. Basically, some states are concerned about what their legal situation is as a state that has not ratified the amendments. And the answer to that should be quite obvious. Well, if you ratify the amendments, you have that concern no longer. That is true, and it is in fact the case that some states that have ratified the amendments, they also had some internal discussions about what this particular part of the amendments mean, but they also said that, well, we don't really have to decide this because it only affects states that have not ratified the amendments, which we will no longer be once we have ratified. So that may be just an additional argument in addition to what we have in the handbook. And maybe on a slightly more serious note, there are currently these discussions going on. They will be resolved, I'm very confident, one way or another by the end of this year. And afterwards, there will be some additional information in this process that can then hopefully also help those states to come on board and help and ratify as well domestically. Then, Chair, you got me on the use of the word easy to prosecute, and when I said the word easy, I regretted it immediately. I shouldn't have said that crimes of aggression would be easy to prosecute. I should have said they would be maybe slightly less excruciatingly difficult to prosecute. And that is because the definition of aggression points to what the leader actually does. And you do not primarily have to go into the field, into the battleground, and first, gather evidence on the ground about war crimes and then establish the link to the leader. It is much more direct, and it is often actually reflected even in documentation, even in public speech, because it's about ordering, it's about inciting the illegal use of force against another state. So it's much more direct. Now, when you mention Nuremberg, and that it was maybe not so easy there. Again, I did not say that the Nuremberg trials were easy, but maybe one distinction there is that in the Nuremberg trials, there were dozens of defendants. And the further down you go the chain of command, the further you expand the circle of influence, and you try to still prove that the person was responsible for a crime of aggression, the more difficult. But the actual leader, especially when it's an authoritarian state, the one single person on the top, I think is usually a relatively straightforward case. And just briefly, because you also mentioned in that context the much bigger question, well, when is the use of force justified and when not? And we would have to hold a whole separate hearing on this question. Here I would maybe just emphasize on the one hand that, of course, under this definition of aggression, use of force in self-defense and as authorized by the Security Council cannot possibly qualify as a crime of aggression. Now, there can be cases that are less clear. And here I would add that we added this threshold clause in the definition that basically says only the most egregious and clearest cases of aggression are cases that should be prosecuted by an international court with an individual as an accused. That does not mean that other cases that are maybe not so egregious and not so clear could not be illegal under international law, or that they would not trigger state responsibility. But for us to send a leader of a country to court for having committed the crime of aggression, we are applying the highest threshold. And that was, on the one hand, based on the precedent of Nuremberg, and on the other hand, a core element for us to be able to agree on that definition. And as I said, this part of the definition was not just agreed to by ICC states parties, it was agreed to by a working group that was open to all UN member states. And I can assure you, they all were there when it was adopted. Thank you.
Point well taken. Most of the Nazi leaders were dead by the most senior Nazi leaders were dead by the Nuremberg trial. So that was a point well taken. Now we have allowed and waited for a second round of questions. So, Ms. Gomez, if you have any, please let us have them now.
Thank you. I'd like to ask actually the External Action Service and the Commission if you can tell us what they're doing to actually support civil society in the EU and outside the EU in the efforts to indeed fight against impunity through the ICC, bringing cases to the ICC, like, of course, the case of obvious case of the violations in Syria, gross war crimes, and crimes against humanity in Syria, and for instance, to support the efforts of some entities who are locally working to collect the evidence and to bring the cases to the court when they will be, it will be possible to actually try those cases, like, for instance, the Yazidis that were victims of genocide. I think the EU could play a very important role in directly supporting the court, but directly supporting the civil society who is collecting the evidence to actually one day bring the case to the court. Not to mention, of course, the kind of political support with the authorities of different countries, as it has already been highlighted by Mr. Donat Katin. And then I'd like to ask as well, what, from the point of view of the court, if the court had any role, advisory or other, on the trial of Hissène Habré in Senegal, which was recently just had the confirmation by an appeal court. I think it was a pretty important case of fight against impunity, of persistence of civil society, where a member state actually decided to put its court system at that service, but that doesn't exclude collaboration with the ICC, and I wonder if there was any throughout the process. Thank you.
Very specific questions. Maybe we'll take it the other way around. If you have any comments? No. I think most of them will be for you to answer.
I'll just address the last question, the question of the Habré trial. And as mentioned, it is a tremendous example of the operation of the Rome Statute system, because this is a case where, using extended jurisdiction, a state took the responsibility to carry out the particular trial. So it's entirely consistent with the principle of complementarity. The entire process was very supported by the International Criminal Court. I know that at least two of the principals, and perhaps all three, were present at the opening of the trial to demonstrate that this reflected how the Rome Statute system functioned. I'm not certain if there was specific collaboration between the court, but certainly that goes on in many scenarios where there may be prosecutions in a local context as well as work that the court is doing. So there is certainly, and the Rome Statute contemplates that there would be assistance both ways, obviously cooperation with the court, but also the court cooperating with national jurisdictions in terms of their investigations and prosecutions. So I think it is an example to be replicated and encouraged, and it's precisely what the Rome Statute system was designed to do.
Mr. Katzen, you asked for a short remark?
Yes, only to come back to one point that was made before on the issue of Africa and the ICC. I just want to stress really that the wave of withdrawals that we have seen in October last year created such a strong reaction from national and international civil society. And together with intergovernmental organizations like the EU and others, we've been able to really change a discourse. Let me also, in this respect, proudly comment on the fact that it was from within the African National Congress, the majority in the parliament, that the implementation of the Rome Statute of the ICC repeal bill that the government put forward to remove the legislation to implement the Rome Statute and then allow a situation in which there would be a vacuum out of which withdrawal would be possible again. This bill has been removed from Parliament more than a month ago, and some of the leaders of that political party, who also in part joined our organization, told us this is gone for good. We don't like this type of legislation. We don't want to make step backs in our history. We don't want to be criticized by all. We don't want to lose court cases, because there was a court case brought by the Southern African Litigation Center that declared that the failure to arrest President Bashir of Sudan in 2015 was in violation of South African law, not only international law, but in that particular case, South African law. So all these things together, and of course Gambia. In Gambia there was a peaceful, almost peaceful, because Senegal put some troops into the territory of Gambia, even if they didn't use armed force, but they facilitated a peaceful transition to power, and Gambia rejoined the ICC and many other things, and now we are working with Gambian parliamentarians to also implement the Rome Statute like South Africa did, so that these things cannot happen again. It's really a complex situation, but I think it was, I really want to put forward on the record here that where we were, as it was said a few months ago, we are not anymore, and the work is continuing to make sure that things continue for good. Last week, to finish, the prosecutor of the court was invited by the Parliament of Niger. She addressed an audience of hundreds of members of parliament, the media and so on. She was the first news in the media. She re-established a relationship with the society. It was an outcome of a project that we had undertaken in Dakar in December. But these are things that are ongoing, and we need to continue, because at the end of the day, the message of the court is certainly much more convincing, popular, and politically acceptable also for the public opinions in Africa and other places. And those who instead want to obscure and try to boycott the work of the court, they don't represent the view of Africans or of other citizens of the world.
Fantastic. There was also a partly question for the EEAS. Would you like to have the floor again? Okay.
Very briefly, yes, indeed, the European Union also supports in a very practical, operational way the work of the ICC. We have a strong EU commitment and a 2011 Council decision and action plan explains everything we do in support of the court. And in terms of financing, since 2000, approximately 37 million euros have been used in either in direct support of the ICC or of civil society that works for the promotion of the Rome Statute. And a new contract has just been signed, as it is done every year, with the court to continue that support during 2016 and 17. Yeah, the European Union also promotes the Rome Statute by financing directly the court. And also I'd like to draw your attention to the fact that the evaluators of the European Instrument on Democracy and Human Rights, which is one of the main sources of this support, have just published their report. And they have, it's an independent evaluator obviously, but they've also underlined the importance for the EU to continue to support the fight against impunity and in particular the support to the court. So that means that the support will be continued for the remainder of the instrument. Thank you.
Thank you. I think that will conclude today's hearing on this very interesting topic. I'll thank all three of you very much for your time. It has been very well qualified and high-level information you have been able to provide us. We are very thankful that you took the time and effort to come here and give it to our committee. We could have had a bit of better attendance, and I think that we should maybe reflect in the future on the right format to do these kind of things, but it doesn't in any way reflect our experts' knowledge, all the interesting point of view we got from all three of you. So thank you very much for coming and joining this committee meeting. This also concludes today's agenda. I will say that tomorrow we have an enlarged bureau at 9 o'clock, and then we resume the committee agenda at 10 o'clock. Until then, we are in recess. Thank you very much for today.